Hello and welcome to the Vineyard Haven Library. This is part one of the two-part series, Tick Ecology and Tick-Borne Diseases with Patrick Roden-Reynolds and Leah Hamner. In today's presentation, Patrick will discuss the basics of tick ecology and behavior, and Leah will be monitoring the chat. And then on Wednesday, October 9th, Leah will discuss tick-borne diseases on Martha's Vineyard, and Patrick will monitor the chat. Patrick Roden-Reynolds is a public health biologist for the Inter-Island Public Health Excellence Collaborative and director of the Martha's Vineyard Tick Program. His work focuses on education and surveillance of vector-borne diseases and their vector populations. Leah Hamner is an epidemiologist for the Inter-Island Public Health Excellence Collaborative. She focuses on infectious diseases of public health significance and promotes data-informed decision-making to support healthier communities. Welcome, Patrick and Leah.
Thanks. Yeah, so my name's Patrick, and as a part of the Inter-Island Public Health Excellence, I'm director of the MV Tick Program, which is a local outreach and education kind of nonprofit or initiative where we focus on a lot of public outreach, education on tick awareness, tick prevention, tick bite prevention, but we also are involved with monitoring and surveillance of the vector-borne populations. But just want to be aware that MV Tick program exists. We do have a website where we host some of this information, and then also contact information. You can reach out with any tick-related questions. So this will be a little bit different from my usual tick ecology and prevention talk. This will be the larvae season, or the larval edition, because this is what we're kind of experiencing right now. I'm not sure if some of you watching this talk had come across a Vineyard Gazette article by Susan Bellencampy called Bumps and Bites. But I'll be talking over these sentiments covered in this story, and kind of what we feel like the community is experiencing right now, which is a rash of bites or scattered bites or polka dot bites causing from some type of bug or insect. So we'll be kind of talking over those points today. But to start with some main basics, some tick basics. There are multiple species of tick on Martha's Vineyard. We have about 6 or 7, but we really only are concerned with 3 and possibly 4 now. The longhorn tick is kind of a new arrival. But the 3 main human biting ticks or medically important ticks are the deer tick, lone star tick, and the dog tick. When you start talking about ecology and behavior and the host preferences between all these ticks, it becomes very complicated very quickly, because the 3 species are different. The 3 life stages within the species are different. So today I'm going to be focusing on that larval stage, the larvae. So looking at this card, these are real ticks that I've field collected and then posted on a piece of computer paper behind tape. We have the 3 life stages within the tick. So for the deer tick and the lone star, I include those 3 biting life stages: the larvae, the nymph, and the adults. Typically, when I do these talks, it's the nymph stage and the adult stage, which are kind of the stars of the show or the focus of the talk. It's the nymph stage that is most active in summer. They're typically the biggest cause of tick-borne disease in humans. And it's the nymph and adult stages that are kind of the riskiest ticks during May, June, July, those main summer months. But right now we're in this transition period where it's end of summer and the larvae start to emerge late summer, early fall. So this is what I'll be focusing on, the larvae stage. And just a note for the dog ticks, I only include the adults because only the adult stage seems to bite people. The dog tick larvae and dog tick nymphs rarely, if ever, bite humans. So they're really not of concern for either causing bites or causing tick-borne disease. And then a small note on the longhorn tick, which I have found on Martha's Vineyard both this year and last. So it might just be another tick in the environment. It's not known to be a very aggressive human biting tick, more so of like livestock, dogs or deer, but it's something to be aware of. So I talked about how we're in a transitional period for ticks. So this kind of figure shows when the ticks are active. Across the top bar is the months of the year, January through December, and then the three kind of rows are the different species: deer tick, Lone Star tick, and the American or the dog tick. And the different colored bars within each species are the different life stages. So this kind of shows the activity patterns of each species and each life stage within the species. So they're a little bit different. If we use deer tick adult, so if we look in the deer tick column at the yellow bar, um, deer tick adults are just starting to become active in September and into October, and they're actually active all through winter and spring, depending on temperatures. So the main point from this is that a risk of getting a tick bite is all year long between the three different species. But if you look between May, June, and July, that's when most of the bars overlap between all the species and the different life stages. So that's typically why those middle summer months are the riskiest. But if you look where we are now, middle of September and October, you can see that the adult deer ticks are transitioning in. Deer tick nymphs and Lone Star nymphs, the ones in the red, they're kind of fading out. They're still active. I could still find a few on my survey, but it's a fraction of what we would have found in May or June. So right now, kind of the blue bars are in full color. It's that larval stage. I can start finding tick larvae typically as late as July. Sometimes I can find Lone Stars earlier in the year, but usually starting late July, August, and September are the peak months for the larval stage of the ticks. So it's just a seasonal thing. If anything, it's the adult females have been working all spring and summer to acquire a blood meal from some host. They dropped off, laid the eggs, and the eggs developed over summer to hatch late summer. And now the larvae are out questing or out looking for their very first blood meal. So I just want to highlight a recent research paper that the MV Tick program, along with some colleagues from University of Massachusetts, Allison Snow and Stephen Rich, we just worked on publishing and compiling about 12 to 13 years of yard survey data. And that's probably the biggest thing is that the TIC program does. We have a yard survey program where we'll visit your house, your property from May 15th through July 31st. And we'll do a tick drag. We'll sample for ticks. We'll do a tick assessment, kind of talk over your recommendations of how you can reduce your risk or how you can prevent these bites. But we do record the data on number of ticks, kind of what species found, and we worked on compiling this data and looking at the spread of Lone Star ticks across Martha's Vineyard in the last 10 to 12 years, but also the persistence of black-legged ticks. So the bar chart here is just kind of two comparisons between Chappaquiddick and Chilmark, where we did surveys for the longest period. We started doing yard surveys in 2011, and then we opened up those yard surveys to all towns on the island in 2016. So we only use Chappie and Chilmark just because we have the longest string of data, or the most data for. The blue bars, so the bar graphs are essentially showing the proportion of yards where we found 3 or more ticks, whether it's the black-legged or deer ticks in blue bars, or Lone Star ticks in orange bars. And the focus of this paper was kind of on the spread of Lone Stars and how things have just completely changed in the last 10 years. Whereas back in 2011 to 2015, it was either 0% of yards in Chilmark had Lone Star ticks, or a very small percentage of yards in Chappaquiddick had at least 3 Lone Star ticks. Fast forward to surveys between 2020 and 2024, the last 4 years, it's upwards of 60 or 80% of yards we're now finding Lone Star ticks in the yards. So it's been a complete flip-flop with what we find. Now, deer ticks, they've had some ups and downs in Chilmark, depending which graph you're looking at, but overall, there's kind of a comparable amount. And tick populations, they do have annual fluctuations from year to year, but overall, this kind of paper was focusing on the spread of Lone Star ticks. So here's the map from that yard survey data. I just kind of want you to focus on the left side, the A, B, and C um, pictures. So each dot on this map is a yard survey. So regardless of the size of the dot or the color, this is where we conducted a yard survey. And the number of ticks we found is proportional to the color and the size of the dot. So green dots you see on any of these maps were surveys we found 0 ticks or 0 of that species. And then it goes up from there, where yellow and orange was about 3 to 15 ticks, and the darker red colors can be 25, 50 or more ticks. The top column is the early years, the middle column is our middle section of years from 2016 to 2019, and then the bottom column, C and F, are the last 4 years of the data from 2020 on. But if you look at the left-hand side, A, B, and C, the beginning surveys on picture A, it was mostly green dots. So we weren't finding many Lone Star ticks. And then it was just from then on, it was a slow, maybe not so slow encroachment northward of the Lone Star ticks, whereas we can find them in all 6 towns now. They're becoming more abundant in Tisbury and Oak Bluffs. By far, they're still the most abundant in Up Island or Chappaquiddick communities, but we can still find Lone Star ticks across the island now. So typically, this is where I would go into talking about the adults and nymphs and things that are associated diseases with them. But I'm going to be skipping over the nymph stage or the adult stage and focusing specifically on the larvae. I'm focusing a lot on Lone Star larvae because I think they're the main culprit or the main ones causing most of these bites, most of these people struggling with a rash of bites. Deer tick larvae bite as well. People have probably been getting bitten by larvae in the late summer, early fall all their life. But it's different than Lone Stars for 2 reasons. One being that the deer tick larvae don't get in these nasty clusters like you see in the picture before you, or something that we might call a tick bomb. Deer tick larvae are laid in egg masses, but they disperse a little, where you get maybe a half dozen or a dozen little ticks on you at once, compared to Lone Star larvae, which get in these crazy clusters of their egg masses, and you end up getting hundreds of individuals on you at once, which is common. Their egg masses are laid anywhere from 3,000 to 5,000 individuals, so you could even get thousands of little baby ticks on you. So the deer tick, they don't get in those crazy clusters, so you might get bites, but it won't cause a rash of bites where your whole leg is bitten up. It might just cause a few itchy bug bites, really, or would maybe compare it to a couple of mosquito bites. And number 2, there's really no concern of sickness or infectious disease from the deer tick larvae. Typically, the larval stage of the tick, any species of tick, they're sterile. They don't carry infectious disease. They have to pick that up from the host of their first blood meal. But there is concern about alpha-gal syndrome and developing sensitivity to alpha-gal from Lone Star larvae bites. Which is kind of new news to me last year learning this, is that larvae bites are kind of attributed to some type of sickness. But even with deer tick larvae, there's no concern about alpha-gal, there's no concern about Lyme disease or some of the other infectious diseases that deer ticks transmit. So all they would really cause deer tick larvae bites would be an itchy bug bite. Lone Star larvae are kind of the focus of the larval talks because they get in these terrible clusters where people are experiencing dozen, 50, 100 bites or more at once. And even if there is no concern about developing alpha-gal allergy or the alpha-gal syndrome, which Leah will probably talk more about in her talk in the part 2 series, even if there are no concerns about kind of developing that from larvae bites, I've heard from people that just the itchy, irritating bites can be just terrible to deal with. They're having trouble sleeping. They're reaching out to doctors, just trying to find any type of remedy for just the itchiness alone, which seems to be normal for Lone Star bites for whatever reason. They seem to cause very irritating, itchy bites, whether it's a single nymph bite or 50 bites from larvae at once. So the tick larvae are ticks. They shouldn't burrow into their skin. They shouldn't be living on your skin for weeks. But when they do bite, they do attach to the skin and feed for multiple days if undisturbed. But larvae are very delicate, where I think they either get killed quickly or they drop off the host quickly when disturbed. And I think one thing causing their itchy bites is that people start to itch, or maybe it's the rubbing up against the clothing once they do bite. I feel like when people get larvae bites, they never see a tick. For one thing, they're pretty microscopic. In the picture, you can see I have the nymphs on the tape circled. If you've seen a tick nymph, you already understand how small that is. Next to the larvae, they're essentially, they look like poppies or pepper is how I describe the larvae. They look like pepper. But so typically when people get the bites, they never see the larvae, and it leaves them confused with what's biting. But if the larvae feed successfully and get a full blood meal, they'll molt into nymphs the following year. But most people, when they experience larvae bites, I would almost say you're lucky to see them crawling on you first, because it gives you a chance to get the larvae off before they bite. But most people wake up in the middle of the night, or they wake up the next day and they look down and their leg or their groin is just covered with bites. And I think part due to the itchiness or the delicate of the tick kind of drops off, or it ends up not being there for very long. But unfortunately, the damage is pretty done because it's already bitten and caused that irritation. So this is kind of what a classic case of tick larvae bites would look like. It can span very different, where you get a dozen bites. This is probably 50 to 75 bites. Some people get hundreds of bites. I would say typically larvae bites are on the foot or ankle, the lower parts of the body, but I've definitely seen larvae bites around the knee, up around the groin for sure, and even as high as the belly and torso. I've never really seen, in my experience, I've never seen larvae bites above the chest, around the head or neck or shoulders, but that could be a different story for folks who are gardening or playing in a pile of leaves with kids, or end up on the ground on all fours. But typically larvae bites, they're on the ground level. Sometimes they bite immediately, where you end up with a picture like this, lots of bites on your ankle in a clustered area. Or sometimes they travel further up the body, because that's kind of the tick instinct to do, and you end up getting bites around your groin. But naturally, the bites can take weeks to heal and just end up being terribly itchy and irritating. So I have some imagery I get the question all the time is, how do we avoid the tick bombs or the tick clusters, whatever you want to call them? Normally, you'll never see them on the ground. You just end up seeing them on your leg, or in most cases, people just never knew they encountered the ticks, and they just have a bunch of bites the next day. So I have some pictures and videos of what the tick cluster or the larvae cluster kind of looks like. And just keep in mind, these are the Lone Star larvae. The deer tick larvae don't quest as larvae in these kind of group clusters together. But this is a bunch of Lone Star larvae, baby ticks, hanging out on the end of a blade of grass. And they're essentially just searching for their next meal, or questing. And they're essentially waiting for something to brush up against them. But it's just a 30-second video. And watching this today, it popped in my mind, they kind of look like brown sugar, is what I would describe it as. But you can kind of see their little legs moving. They're all stacked up on top of each other. And this is just the Lone Star larva behavior. When they get on the host, they try to get on the host en masse. So that was a good video. It kind of showed the ticks clearly. This one takes it to another level where this person happened to find or notice a little cluster on the underside of a blade of a grass, just like the last video we saw. But she presses up against a clipboard and it causes the ticks to spread across the clipboard and from there spread, disperse across the host because they think they got on a host. So maybe this will be a good visualization of how you can see how people are getting these clusters of bites or how when the larvae get on you, there's just hundreds of them. So that's just a blade of grass. And again, you can just see all the tiny ticks just stacked up on each other. And they're just waiting for physical contact against something. And here in a second, she'll push it up against the clipboard. But there isn't any audio on this video. I'm just kind of narrating through. But the ticks now, they're off the grass and onto the clipboard. And from here, they just disperse as fast as they can. It's a little gross, but maybe you can understand now how when you do get bit from the larvae, you're getting lots of bites at once, or you're getting lots of bites in a clustered area versus your typical tick bite from a nymph or adult, which is just one. Usually the problematic tick bites are just the one you didn't notice or the one, up in your hair that you can't see. But the larvae, they'll get on you in these big group clusters. So this is a picture from one of our collaborators out of Tufts University, Sam Telford. This picture is from Tuckernuck Island, so not necessarily Martha's Vineyard. Tuckernuck has some of the worst or the highest densities of Lone Star ticks recorded. And Sam probably has 10 to 12 different clusters of Lone Star ticks on his leg. If the last video we saw was just one individual cluster, and one cluster can have anywhere from 100 to 1,000 ticks in it, Sam probably has a good 10,000 larvae on his legs. But Lee had made a good point with this video is he's not running away looking for a lint roller. He's not looking to set his leg on fire, or he's not looking for bug spray. He took out a phone and he took a picture of it because he thought it was interesting. And that's because when he goes out and does his field work, all of his clothing is permethrin treated, which I'll touch on a lot more later. But his shoes, his socks, and his pants are all treated. So within a few minutes after taking this video, I bet you all those ticks were either falling off his leg or dead, and he just continued about his day, continued more sampling for ticks. So that's going to be the end of this talk, is how we can kind of prevent these bites, because the larvae, they're very prolific. They end up being in a lot of areas that a normal tick would be. And that's why so many people in the community might be experiencing these kind of bites. And we're about to go into, well, before I do that, so here's some other imagery I got yesterday, actually, of a tick bomb. I'd been dying to try and find my own tick bomb on grass or on vegetation. Usually I only notice it before it's on my leg or on my tick drag sampling towel. But I was walking through a field yesterday, and it almost seemed like every other step, literally every other step, I was getting new ticks on my legs, new clusters, just like this picture of Sam. So I stopped and looked down, and I started noticing these little brown clusters or balls on the ends of blades of the grass. So sometimes the clusters can be a long strip on the end of the blade of the grass. Sometimes it can be smaller little clusters on a single plant. So the picture on the left is just, I think it's a goldenrod plant, but it's just a single plant, and you can see all the green and white arrows are pointing to a different minute cluster of ticks. The bigger cluster of ticks probably has 50 individuals, and the smaller cluster probably has 15. And the zoomed in picture with the red arrow is one of those zoomed in clusters, and maybe you can see the little tick stretching out his front arms, waiting kind of for physical contact to brush up against something. And then the picture on the right is my pant leg. It's looking down my left pant leg. You can see some clusters, not very in zoom or in focus, but you can see some clusters are still on the plant, waiting to come in contact with the host. Others have already been on my pant leg. But again, I'm wearing permethrin treated clothing, so I stop and take a photo. I have a small video demonstrating permethrin treated clothing, but I trust the clothing because it outright kills and repels the ticks. So that's the end of like the tick section. A lot of complaints have been coming in from community members, or a lot of reports about getting a rash of bites, clusters of bites, and I feel strongly that it's the tick larvae, because we are on Martha's Vineyard. We know we're covered in ticks. It's a seasonal thing where, beginning late July and certainly into August, September, the larvae come out where you're more likely to get a cluster of bites. There's also other potential biters that we cannot ignore, and I want to talk over and maybe dispel some rumors or at least provide some information. So a lot of folks out there might have heard some oak mites, or they might be blaming oak mites for their bites. So this mites can be kind of complicated because there's hundreds of species. Some feed exclusively on plants. Some oak mites are predatory, where they feed on other insect larvae. So this is a screenshot of a research article published in 2006 by a department or Kansas State University, where there was an outbreak of bites among community members in, I want to say, Lincoln, Nebraska, somewhere in the Midwest, whether it's Nebraska, Kansas, or Missouri. So they brought out some researchers and were taking samples, and they discovered this European species of oak mite, the scientific name being the Peymodes herfsii. But they did discover this oak mite, which can cause bites to human, or can cause bites. But which these were just kind of the first discoverance of it. And that's in the bottom left is a picture of the oak mite, which they're literally microscopic. They're, less than a couple hundred micrometers, so maybe 0.3 millimeters. It'd be almost impossible to see it with your naked eye. But the oak mites have a very complicated behavior and kind of life cycle compared to ticks or other bugs or insects. Like I mentioned, these oak mites, this specific species, the Peymodes herfsii, is a predatory or a carnivorous mite, where it feeds on the insect larvae in the oak galls. So these oak mites aren't causing the oak galls on the trees themselves. And if you're not familiar with an oak gall it's a deformation on the tree caused by insects. It's kind of like a tumor, but doesn't harm the tree too much. These oak mites feed on the insect larvae inside the oak galls, and when they feed successfully, they emerge, and their larvae, or the adult offspring, rain down out of the oak trees. And if they happen to land on a mammal, or they happen to land on something, they can cause bites to humans. So here, like pictures from the same paper, these are kind of the classic bites caused from the oak mites. And then the picture on the right is just a picture of the oak galls that are the main culprits. There's a wide variety of oak galls, but it's typically the galls that cause the leaf curls in the margins or the veins of the leaf, not necessarily like the marble galls that are common around here. But the important thing about the oak mites is, since they're raining out of the galls, out of the trees, when people do get bites, they typically end up on the necks, the shoulders, or the upper torso. They seem to be the most affected area versus the ticks, which are the opposite, which are coming from the bottom up. But when it comes to pictures of the bites, the oak mites are known to cause kind of like more pustule or little pimple-like bites, which is not impossible to be similar for tick bites. So sometimes it's hard to differentiate between the bites when you don't actually have an insect or something to look at or confirm. So the oak mites are a real thing. they can actually bite humans. That specific species of oak mite really has only been found a few places across the US. We talked with someone from the Massachusetts Department of Ag, and they confirmed that this species of oak mite has never been confirmed or never been sighted in New England. I think the closest sightings have been unconfirmed sightings in Pennsylvania. Um, but they have found spotted areas of this in the Midwest where it is biting and affecting people. So on Martha's Vineyard, we do have a native oak mite, and just like I mentioned earlier, there's hundreds of species of mites, all very different. So we do have a native species of mite that is currently in the oak trees and other hardwood trees outside right now. This one is typically called the oak red mite or the Oligonchus bicolor. So it's a completely different species. This one feeds on leaves and other plant material or vegetation, so it doesn't bite humans. It's not capable of biting humans. It's probably looks like, and it's really no different than your common garden spider mite, the little red mite that you might see on your tomato plants. Common plants it infects is not just the oak, but hickory, beech, birch, a lot of other hardwood species. So we do have oak mites here, but as of now, there's no confirmed sightings. There's no evidence that the Peymodes herfsi, or the human biting mite, is on Martha's Vineyard or kind of anywhere near New England. That said, we've heard enough complaints, and I've heard differing stories that where people are getting bites on their upper torso, or they are experiencing bites that don't necessarily sound indicative of tick bites. So it's something we're going to look into and double check. So we're asking folks to submit potential oak galls. If you come across oak galls in your backyard, you can store them in a Ziploc baggie and put them in the freezer until transferring them to me. You can either drop them off at my office at 9 Airport Road, or just contact my email and we can arrange either a pickup or drop off. I already have a few samples in my freezer now, and in looking at the picture on the top right, oak galls come in a variety of shapes and sizes. Mostly of what I have found is the marble galls, which will look like little marbles on the ground. But it seems like the main culprit we're looking for, or the suspect oak galls, would be on the picture on the left, which are little curls on the leaf margins. Um, those might be more important than other types of galls, but still, we'll take all samples, and it's something we're going to look into, because just as those communities in the Midwest, they had never had those biting species of mites before, they do now. And similarly with the story of Lone Star ticks here, 15, 20 years ago, Lone Star ticks were not here, whereas now they're widespread and common. So it's something we're going to look into, and not only just discount these stories, but hopefully verify or try to confirm either they do exist, or we're still not finding any evidence of these types of oak mites. So those were the first two players. Tick larvae, which I believe is causing most of the bites. There's also the oak mites. And then lastly, chiggers, if you've ever heard of chiggers. So chiggers is just a common name. And what chiggers are specifically the larval stage of another species of mite. So it's different than oak mites. They're in different families, completely different types of mites. But chiggers are specifically the larval stage, which are the only parasitic stage. They're the only biting stage of these families of mites. Chiggers, unlike ticks, they feed on tissue, not blood. So chiggers do bite humans. They do cause irritating bites. Chiggers are known to kind of burrow into the skin and live in there while they digest the skin and feed off those tissues until they emerge. And that's why they're known to cause particularly irritating, itchy bites for days on end, because you can have a parasite kind of living on the skin versus a tick, which only stays attached to the outside of the skin, and then will drop off after it's fully fed. But because of this biting behavior, chiggers do cause something called trombiculasis, which is just kind of a a skin irritation caused from the bites and caused from the saliva when the chiggers bite. As far as their distribution throughout Massachusetts, very little is known about them. Sam Telford, who has provided some of the pictures on the ticks, he had just found proof of chiggers in Massachusetts, in I think Windham, Massachusetts, which is north of Boston. So chiggers have been, he's working on publishing this information. So chiggers have been found in Massachusetts, but it sounds like their distribution would be scarce or rare at best. So again, it's not something I think is common, widespread enough to be affecting as many community members as I've talked to and experienced. But again, it seems to be more of an issue in mid-Atlantic regions. If you've been from Maryland, Virginia, or further down in the South, chiggers are much more common. These pictures are also from Sam Telford, who deliberately exposed himself to chiggers as a part of this getting proof for chiggers' existence in Massachusetts. I don't I don't recommend you trying this at home, but here's at least a little picture of how at least to me, chigger bites look a little different. The oak mites and tick bites, I wouldn't be able to tell the difference, but at least chigger bites, they seem to be a little more round, reddish, irritated lesions. And if you look in the picture, the top left, that little boil or blister, Salmon noted that was completely unexpected from those bites. So the top two pictures are from Sam Telford, and the bottom left one is just from a completely different study about chigger bites, but you can see how it still mimics that kind of round red lesion versus a single clean bite. And to make things kind of even more complicated, I touched on longhorn ticks here on Martha's Vineyard. I found my first few nymphs last year. I found a few more nymphs and some adults this year. Sam Telford confirmed, I think last week, that he picked up a larval cluster or a larvae bomb of the longhorn ticks on Nantucket, not Martha's Vineyard. This was near the Nantucket field station. So this is kind of news to us that I was only aware that Lone Star ticks occurred, or Lone Star larvae occurred in these big clusters of baby ticks, but apparently the longhorn ticks do as well. I haven't come across a cluster, or at least haven't confirmed a cluster of larval longhorn ticks yet. What's different about them is they don't seem to be aggressive human biters. They seem to prefer more livestock and deer. So Sam mentioned that maybe if you run into some of these clusters, you're not as likely to get bites or as many bites as it were a Lone Star cluster. And still to this date, so longhorn ticks were first found in the U.S. in 2017. They came across on I think a shipment of sheep to New Jersey. And since 2017 in New Jersey, they've spread across the East Coast and they've been confirmed in most states. We found the first occurrence in Martha's Vineyard last year. As of now, they're not known to transmit disease in the U.S. and they're not known to be aggressive human biters. So they're kind of lower on our concern list compared to our top three, the deer tick, Lone Star tick, and dog tick. But it's certainly something to be aware of because in their native range back in Asia, they can transmit some diseases and they can bite humans. So it's something to be aware of. And at this point, we don't really know if this tick will end up being a major human health threat or if it'll be more just of another tick in the environment. I had mentioned there's 3 other tick species out on Martha's Vineyard that you just never hear of because they don't bite humans, including rabbit tick, winter tick, and something called the groundhog tick, which I have collected on my field surveys, but they just don't bite humans. They're not a concern. And some people might be wondering is why things keep getting worse and worse. Is what has changed in the last decade? What has changed in the last 50 years of why ticks have gone from, for people who grew up on Martha's Vineyard, they really tell me stories of it was only the wood tick or the dog tick, same name, or same tick, just different names. Part of it, you could boil it kind of down into 4 reasons, and 4 of these topics you could do a whole hour-long talk by itself. But for me, it boils down to globalization, where it's easier spread of hitchhiking parasites. And the best example is what I just gave of the longhorn tick. Longhorn tick was an Asian species. It was not found in the U.S. until 2017. That came over on a shipment of livestock. And then also a big thing, one of the bigger tells of why the tick populations have changed is the resurgence of common hosts like deer and turkey and other common mammals. Uh, it's important to remember, at least that I learned in school, that deer and turkey and some of these game animals were nearly extinct in the 1900s or the early 1900s, especially on the East Coast. Um, it wasn't until 30s, 40s, or 50s and reintroduction efforts and some conservation efforts had just changed, where now we just have very high densities of these common hosts, common tick hosts. Um, they're also no longer a common food source, so they're more just abundant in high densities living among people versus what this interaction with the common host we had years ago. And this kind of ties into the next bullet point of land use and development and how suburbanization creates perfect habitat for these tick hosts. So a lot of development and fragmentation creates edge habitat, which is the transition from woods to open fields. And we always say, what loves edge habitat and these fragmented habitats and these areas of development? It's deer, rabbit, squirrel, turkey, all the common hosts for ticks. So we have high densities of hosts living with high densities of humans in and among the habitat. So the ticks don't really have a problem finding hosts and finding a successful blood meal. And because of the habitat we live in these more kind of rural or suburban areas where we have open space behind our backyards, we have undeveloped chunks of land between houses. It's the perfect kind of exposure for ticks as well, as where we're more exposed to ticks. And then the last kind of point is climate change, is how the climate will, if it's expected to get warmer or wetter in New England, that will benefit the ticks. The ticks will enjoy the warmer weather by having extended times of activity, like that graph I showed you of when the ticks are active throughout the year. Those should, in theory, get longer if the ticks are emerging earlier and going away later if it's based on temperature. But also a lot of tick activity is based on humidity. So in areas where it's predicted to get wetter, tick survival may increase. And there might be less mortality during the hot summer dry spells. But it's also important to consider that this may cause variable change. In places like the South, where it's expected to get hotter and drier, that may be less beneficial for ticks. That might be bad for ticks, where ticks are really sensitive of drying out. And that can be one of their bigger mortality factors. Which leads us into is how we can protect ourselves and how we can kind of gain our life back without going outside full of paranoia. So by all, for me, the gold standard is permethrin-treated clothing. If you're getting tick bites and you want them to stop, you need to cover up with permethrin-treated clothing. There's several ways to treat your clothing, whether you do it at home or you buy pre-treated clothing that comes, or you buy new clothing that comes pre-treated, or you can send your clothing that you already own off to a company called Insect Shield, and they treat it for you. It's important to remember that permethrin, it kills on contact, but it's not an immediate effect. The ticks need a little bit of exposure time, but it's typically only 30 seconds to about a minute before the ticks are either falling off themselves or they're outright dead from the permethrin. So permethrin outright kills the ticks and it repels the ticks. When I'm out doing my field work and when I'm out doing recreational things like hiking or gardening, I'm making sure my shoes, my socks, my pants, and my shirt, my whole outfit is treated. And that's really is what keeps me safe. And the only way I can say I've been on this job for 3 years, I collect thousands of ticks during the summer, and I've not yet had a single tick bite, knock on wood, since starting this job. It's really attributed to the permethrin treated clothing. So you can buy it locally. You can buy bottles of permethrin, typically next to the bug spray. Just remember to read the active ingredient and make sure it's permethrin, and not one of the other repellents, which we'll also talk about in a second. I've seen it at SBS, Brickman's, Basics, and Oak Bluffs, Shirley's hardware store. I imagine some of the other hardware stores also sell it. But you can buy this at home. You can treat your own clothing, which has instructions on the back of the bottle of how to do it appropriately and how to do it so you can use the product sparingly, because it doesn't take much to appropriately treat your clothing. And then once you do it at home, once it dries on the clothing or the shoes or a backpack that you might set on the ground, once it's dry, it's safe and effective for 6 weeks or 6 washings, kind of whichever comes first. So it lasts a while, which is one of the greater aspects of it. Is once you treat your clothing, it's good for a couple times, and it even lasts through the washing. I highly recommend the professional treatments, whether it's buying brand new clothing, but I am outdoors for work and for recreation so often. I take the clothing that I already own, that I already garden in, that I already hike in, and I send it to Insect Shield, and they treat each garment for about $9. And the professional treatments last 70 washings, a whole lot longer than the at-home application. That's the only difference between the two. The at-home spray is the same permethrin, it's the same concentration, it's the same effectiveness. It just doesn't last on the clothing as long. So if you insect shield your clothing, you get it treated once, and it's good for 1 year easily. I think some of the clothing I wear for work, I even get to stretch it into 2 tick summers where I still feel that it has adequate protection. And take note of the discount code we have on the screen here. Insect Shield has done a lot of great work with us, helping us to boost our outreach efforts, because we truly do believe this is the #1 way people can prevent tick bites. So we have a 15% off discount code through your next order, Insect Shield. Just use Martha's V 2024. And then closely tied to tip #1 is tip #2, and how you wear your clothing and dressing appropriately or smart fashion. So an important part of dressing appropriately for tick safety is tucking in your clothing, which helps prevent the ticks from reaching your skin in the first place. So, we're on an island vacation. We live in an island vacation area, so most people would look like the picture on the left, where they've got open-toed shoes, shorts on, and really not much of a carrier in the world. But that really can lead to easy tick bites. The ticks don't have to work hard to get to the skin, so it often leads to tick bites. So a little bit better dressing, or a little bit more appropriate clothing for around here, would be closed-toed shoes or taller socks. At least this way we can try to balance, being comfortable with being tick prevention. But by and far, if you're doing outdoor activity that is going to lead you to tick exposures, you need to be wearing shoes, tall socks, or just socks and pants and a long sleeve shirt, and then tucking your shirt into your pants. And then when you get in some bad areas, tucking your pants either into socks or boots really can go a long way for keeping the ticks on the clothing and then off the skin. And ideally, these would be permethrin treated as well. which would be your top-notch protection. The person on the right, the full outfit, that's essentially what I'm looking like when I go out do my tick surveys for work. I know it can be a hard sell trying to get people to wear long socks, long pants while they're at home in the summertime. But that's kind of what it takes is to prevent the ticks. Is the ticks have to make contact with the garment or the treated garment, and they have to make contact with it long enough for it to give them enough exposure to either cause them to jump off, not jump because they don't jump, it either causes them to fall off themselves or they just outright die. So having appropriate clothing and covering up as much as possible really goes a long way for preventing those bites.
Patrick, we have an excellent question in the chat after you're done with this particular slide about pets.
Okay. And then, so here's a real life demonstration of the use of clothing. Again, photo courtesy from Sam Telford. He went out tick sampling and he did a self demonstration where he treated one of his socks and he left his other sock untreated with permethrin. So you can see his ankle on the left side from his untreated sock is just a bunch of bites. He got at least 24 bites on his left ankle versus his right sock or his right ankle that had a treated sock on it is perfectly clean and clear because any ticks that got on that leg were either killed or repelled by the permethrin. Another scary fact about the tick larvae is they're small enough to crawl between the fibers of your sock. So even if you're wearing a tall crew sock or a knee sock, it's still possible to get bit on the ankle from larvae. So which is why the permethrin treatment takes it to the next level. And it really does work well. So here's a short video I have of, I got a small Lone Star cluster. I can't even call this a cluster at this point. There's maybe 24 little larvae ticks on my knee, but I'm wearing my treated clothing out doing for a tick survey. So if you look close, you'll see the ticks, normally once they get on you, they're crawling up. They're working to the next point they can get on skin and then bite. Whereas if you look closely, some of these ticks are falling off. They're, raining off. If you can see the little shadows as they fall off my leg. That's because the permethrin treatment on my clothing. I describe it as it's like hot lava on the ticks, where they can walk on it for a little while, but at some point it starts to affect them and it effectively paralyzes the ticks. So the ticks that are already fallen off my leg, whether they subsequently die on the ground, it depends if they've had enough exposure to the permethrin. But all I know is they're off me. And again, an important thing to remember is they're not all falling off at once, but it's a slow and steady decline with the number of ticks on you.
And then may I ask, while we're watching the end of this video, Patrick, the question in the chat is about permethrin safety with pets. Specifically, the question is about dogs, but it has come up before about cats too. So
right.
That's things.
Yes, that's a great question. So permethrin is safe for using around mammals, with one exception is you need to be a little bit more careful around cats. So it's safe to use around dogs, it's safe to use for us. Cats can be a little more sensitive to it. So what I've read about permethrin is that it doesn't readily absorb into our skin in the first place. What does, all mammals except cats have a liver enzyme that breaks down the permethrin and it just kind of passes through us, through our waste. So it really doesn't affect us at all. Cats, they lack that liver enzyme, so they're a little bit more sensitive to permethrin. So it's recommended to keep cats away from wet permethrin or keep them out of the area that you're treating your clothing with. But as I understand, it's safe for the cats once the clothing has been dried and treated for, once it's dried on the clothing, it's treated. But if you're concerned and you have a cat at home, I urge you to just, talk that over with your veterinarian. But as far as use on pets, some permethrin products are rated for using on pets. I know a lot of livestock owners, horses and sheep, they use permethrin-derived products for treating those animals that live outside. So when used appropriately, depending on the product that you have, it's safe to use. There is just that one consideration for cat owners.
Thank you, Patrick.
And when I do these talks, I am all permethrin. Permethrin. I understand it can be a hard sell for covering up for clothing, and that's the important part when you use permethrin treated clothing is you have to cover up. If you're only wearing shoes and socks that are treated and you find yourself getting bites on your knees or groin, that's indication that you need to cover up with a pair of treated pants as well. And I've talked to people, especially folks who work outdoors, where they're just, I can't do it. I won't do it. I won't wear long clothing in the summertime. They said they'll die of heat exhaustion, which to me is totally plausible. And just, we have to balance being comfortable while also living our lives being tick safe. So repellents, your classic repellents, EPA registered repellents are great, not substitute, but complement of permethrin. I think the biggest benefit of repellents like DEET or picaridin, like the classic Off or the classic Repel brands we've been buying, those are still safe and effective. If anything, they're the only rated products that's safe or effective for ticks and mosquitoes. But you can use them on exposed skin and you can use them conveniently. Whereas permethrin, since you don't want to spray it on your skin and you don't spray it on your clothing, you need to prepare your clothing ahead of time and spray it ahead of time before you're using it. Whereas these repellents, with any of the active ingredients we have listed here, you can spray yourself as you're walking out the back door or as you're walking out the door, and it's much more convenient use. And again, you can use it on your exposed skin. So DEET and picaridin are typically some of the more common ones for ticks and mosquitoes, but there are other products. They recommend for tick control to have at least 20 to 25% DEET, but no more than 40%. And then picaridin, similarly, it's a newer product. If you haven't heard of it, what I've read is it is similarly effective as DEET, but I've also heard from people that it's not as greasy, it's not as oily, or it's not as suffocating when you spray it like DEET can be. So a lot of folks are buying picaridin as their kind of repellent of choice. I don't have much personal use with it. I do have 40% DEET at home. But again, I usually rely on my permethrin treated clothing for tick control. The EPA on their website has a tool where you can kind of Google search, or you not search for, which repellent is right for you, because it can kind of be dizzying the amount of products that are on the market. So it gives you a quick couple drop down questions of, what do you need protection from? Ticks, mosquitoes, or both? How long do you need protection? Is it only for an hour or two? Or do you have a job that takes you outside all day where you're going to be outside for 6 to 8 hours? And then you can pick some of these specific products that you might be interested in, or you can choose all of them and it'll spit out a spreadsheet of different registered products for tick and mosquito prevention, and it'll show you how long it's rated for the effectiveness against ticks and mosquitoes. And then sometimes overlooked, but similarly important tip is remove clothing after outdoor activities. If you have access to a clothing dryer, throwing your clothes in the dryer on high heat for 15 minutes can be a great way to kill any ticks that you might be concerned, hitchhiking on your clothing. That way you're not walking straight from outside and down onto the couch and transferring the ticks onto the couch, or worse, giving the ticks a chance to go from your clothing to your skin and bite. So sometimes stripping down as soon as we get outdoors, it gives us a chance to clean our clothes, but also gives us a chance to do a tick check kind of immediately and reduce the risk of tick-borne disease by finding them sooner. If you don't have a dryer at home, sometimes hanging the clothes either outdoors and ideally in a sunny location can help either cause the ticks to fall off or die. If you remember me talking about how ticks desiccate and dry out really quickly, that's why finding a sunny location to hang it will be ideal. Sometimes ticks avoid activity during the hottest parts of the day because they really are sensitive to drying out. That's why, sunny location or putting clothes in the dryer will help kill them. Not necessarily using the washing machine to wash the clothing. If I'm worried about ticks in my clothing, they go in the dryer first, and then I wash them through the regular washing cycle afterwards. And then prevention tip number 5, which you probably have been hearing a lot, but is still so important, are those daily tick checks. So we have the 3 figures on the left, the green, blue, and the red, which just show bites from different species of ticks. So some species have different preferences where they might bite further up the body or different areas, but the darker the color portion on the little figure is, the more likely you are to be bit. So what you should kind of glean from those 3 figures is, first, you can kind of get bit anywhere on the body, but there are some darker areas where you're more likely to find ticks, like the groin, on around the underarms, and certainly up around the scalp and behind the ears as well. So when we're doing a tick check, unfortunately, you just have to look everywhere. You have to do a whole body tick check, but there are hotspot areas, more or less, where it'd be, between the toes, behind the knees, groin, behind the and around the legs, belly button, around the underarms, and then certainly, like I just said, behind the ears and around the scalp line. It's kind of a tick adaptation to bite around the ears on some wild animals. And tick checks, I'll double down in saying that they're very important, because even if you do get bit, it's all about transmission time, or how long the tick is attached, for what your risk of transmission is. And I think Leah would probably touch on more of this for her presentation on the tick-borne diseases. But finding and removing the tick as soon as possible really does reduce your risk for contracting tick-borne diseases, even if you do happen to get bit, because the tick does take hours, and the transmission time can be different from each disease, but usually it takes the tick hours on end to fully attach and fully start feeding. And at that point, once the longer it's attached, the risk starts to creep up. So doing these daily tick checks after outdoor activities and removing those ticks promptly can really reduce your risk for contracting tick-borne diseases. And then number 6 is to have a tick kit. And this can be very useful this time of year. So like I said, most people, when they experience larvae bites, they just kind of wake up in the morning and they just have a bunch of bites on their leg. But if you're lucky enough to either see the ticks or notice them on you, sometimes having a lint roller or tape is a great way for zipping them up off you. And that's before they bit. If they've already bitten, the damage is kind of done, and the ticks are highly adapted for staying attached, where a lint roller or tape directly on the skin probably isn't going to remove an attached tick, but it should pull off the ticks that are crawling around looking for a place to bite. And then aside from that, after the adhesives or the stickiness to get off the ticks, which really works for those larvae, especially if you get in clusters of them, tweezers, fine tip tweezers. That's the recommended way for removing an attached tick, is just trying to grasp them as close to the mouth parts or as close to where the tick attaches to your skin, and gently pulling up. And that way you're removing the tick immediately, as quickly as possible. You're not messing around with some other home remedies like petroleum jelly or a match, or just fine tip tweezers. So make sure you have a pair of those at home. And then alcohol wipes to help clean the tick, or clean the tick bite. You might have heard of the myth in the past, if you leave some of the bits of the tick left behind in the bite, there's still concern for contracting disease. And that's mostly untrue. The worst that really should happen is just a local infection of the bite. So having some alcohol wipes to kind of clean the wound from the bite can be smart to have in your tick kit. Then last couple things here. So prevention number 7 is there's a service run by the University of Rhode Island called Tick Spotters, and you can send them a picture, just a picture of the tick, and they will identify the tick for you. They'll give you a small risk assessment based on the engorgement size of the tick, because they have different levels. It's sometimes they are flat and unfed, other times they are partially fed where they've been attached for either a day or a few days. Other times they're fully engorged where they grow up very gross and gray and balloon-like. But you can send a picture to Tick Spotters to University of Rhode Island, and they'll contact you back with the species of the tick, the life stage, and that brief risk assessment. And that gives you information to talk to, if you go to a doctor's appointment. And it can give you a short list of what you might have been exposed to from the tick bite. Because ticks, they transmit unique suites of diseases, and Leah will be touching on that for sure in her presentation. But from my standpoint, we want to avoid all tick bites so we can avoid the conversation about any of the tick-borne diseases. And then lastly, if you're interested in it, you can also pathogen test your tick. You can test if the tick is carrying any diseases. Tick Spotters is just a identification tool, whereas Tick Report, you mail in the physical tick, and they will do an analysis on the tick to see if it was carrying any diseases. This can be information can be powerful. It can help you, it can inform you, and again, it can inform your conversations with your health provider too. It is $50 for a standard panel or a standard tick test. And we like to say, even if the tick test positive, it doesn't necessarily mean anything was transmitted to you. As I mentioned earlier, that's kind of based on the transmission time and how long it was attached. But at the same time, if a tick comes back negative and you're sure you were not bit by a second tick or had other tick exposures, that negative test can really provide some peace of mind for folks. So again, just another option, and that's tickreport.com. So just to test or send a picture was Tick Spotters out of University of Rhode Island, and to pathogen test your tick is tickreport.com, which is a business. So after all this kind of talks on bites and preventing the bites, I wanted to touch on the last little slide of trying to prevent the rash of bites that people might be experiencing. And unfortunately, there just doesn't seem to be much relief out there. There's the over-the-counter options like oral antihistamines or other Benadryl type related medications. Other people, they need either stronger steroids or other prescriptions where they talk to your doctor. But Sam Telford, his recommendation, as you can see from this presentation that he exposes himself to, bites a time or two. His recommendation for the larvae bites was a mixture of diaper rash cream or baby butt cream, I think a zinc oxide based cream, and then a Benadryl cream mixed together in a kind of a 1-to-1 ratio. And he said that seemed to provide some relief, but a lot of folks I've talked to, there doesn't seem to be much out there that provides relief for these itchy bites. And then just to reiterate of our prevent the bite kind of mantra, just treating clothes with permethrin by far is the gold standard for preventing the tick bites, but also dressing smart when you're outside, and then wearing effective repellents when you either have exposed skin or you don't necessarily have access to permethrin treated clothing. And then following up with daily tick checks and being smart about your clothing after you come home. And then having a plan just in case you do encounter the ticks, whether you're carrying lint rollers or you have tweezers on hand at home. And then having a plan in the future that if you do happen to get an attached tick and you are concerned about your risk, you can reach out either to Tick Spotters or Tick Report, and they can provide some data either before or after you talk to your doctor if you're concerned. And again, please take note of that discount code, Martha's V 2024, and you'll get 15% off the next order through Insect Shield. And that was all I had today. So if you have any questions, we can start either typing them into the chat. But I want to highlight the part 2 of our series coming up with Leah, who I'd mentioned a couple times today, October 9th at 3:30. So if you're interested, tune into that, and she'll be able to discuss more things on disease trends that we see on Cape Cod and Martha's Vineyard, as well as touching on alpha-gal syndrome.
So we
And
do have, no, we do have a question in the chat. If you want to address, are there any predators on Martha's Vineyard for the ticks? With thousands of larvae spotted this year, do we go into the fall with thousands of adult ticks, and how do we reduce the volume?
Right, so good question. As far as predator of ticks, really isn't much out there. It's a good question because I get it in not a debate, but a conversation with folks all the time concerning turkey, quail, chickens, and guinea hen. As far as like the wild birds, like turkeys and quail, they might eat some adult ticks that are questing on the end of a grass, but I don't think they're really eating the larvae or the nymph ticks. And I really don't think they're eating enough to cause biological control or reduction in ticks. As far as like the domestic ones, like chickens and guinea hens, that'd be something a little more of interest in kind of looking into, because chickens, at least, they feed ferociously. They're very aggressive feeders. They'll eat anything, but they also stay in a concentrated area versus a home range, or versus a turkey or quail, which have larger home ranges. I have done a couple yard surveys in the past where they've had kind of free roaming chickens in the yard where I didn't find as many ticks as expected, but I don't really have any hard evidence that kind of points to ground feeding birds as causing any biological control or reduction. There was a part 2, there was a second part to that question, or their question.
It's with thousands of larvae spotted this year, do we go into the fall with thousands of adult ticks? How do we reduce the volume?
Right, so it's not every larvae born is going to turn into an adult. It's more of like a statistical process where maybe a few % of the larvae are actually going to survive to those late stages. So ticks also have a complex life cycle where they're 2 to 3 years old. So an adult tick is 3 years old. If a larvae is born year 1 in the end of summer, if they're successful in finding a blood meal, they overwinter and emerge year 2 as a nymph. And the same thing, if they're successful in finding a blood meal, which not all ticks are, or not all ticks either survive the summer, or not all ticks survive the winter. So it's more of a, not statistics, more of a proportional game where a very small, not small proportion, but a proportion of the actual larvae we're finding today will be biting nymphs the next year.
Any other questions? You can feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question or put it in the chat.
And then I have my my email below if you want to kind of reach out directly as well.
I have a question.
Please go ahead.
The tick program, surveying properties, I know that this year you reached your maximum. When do you open that up again for the next year for anybody who would be interested in that?
So you can just reach out to me right now and just say you have interest, and I'll get you on my list for next year.
Okay.
And then I'll start reaching out to schedule those early May.
Okay.
And the reason we do them from May 15th through July 31st, so I am here full-time year-round, so I'm always available for kind of tick-related questions, but we kind of restrict the surveys to that certain time period because it's peak tick season here.
Yep.
The point of the survey is for me to show up, find as many ticks as possible to kind of give you the most information as possible, versus if I had come now, if I come today to do the survey and find maybe 1 tick, I probably would have found 20 or 30 ticks, but it depends on the yard. So we just don't do the surveys out of season. But I am always available for kind of questions. And
Thank you.
There's two more questions in the chat. First is if people can get the slides. So we will be posting a recording of this presentation, which includes the slideshow, on our Vimeo channel, and everyone will get a link to that recording afterwards. That'll in the next day or two. I don't know, Patrick, if we could also do a PDF of this, or what do you think?
I plan on making the PDF.
Okay.
So we can make that available as well. I will say some of the bite photos will be removed for the PDF version, just kind of as courtesy for the person who provided the photos.
Yeah.
They're waiting for it to publish for their own reasons. So, but in the recording, that's fine. But like the PDF version, it'll have a few less photos.
Okay, so you can share that with me and I'll send it out to everyone. And the other question is keeping the grass short helpful?
Yeah, so it can be. That's one of the main recommendations I make for when I do those yard survey programs. The number one thing I'll tell all my homeowners is to rake and remove leaf litter. Like that's what the ticks are living in, is the debris or the leaf litter layer. A lot of people here on the vineyard associate ticks with long grasses because of the dog ticks, because that's what they grew up with. It was only the dog ticks that were here, which are very closely tied to meadows and grassy areas. So the long grass is still a key tick habitat, just kind of different tick habitat. So certainly like reducing the lawn, and we typically would say, either 5 inches or less kind of reduces that habitat. But people ask me all the time about no mow May, if you're familiar with that kind of term, which you're not mowing your lawn or portions of your lawn until late May to kind of give the chance for pollinators and other things to bloom early season. So I found myself recommending folks, especially for folks that have the space in their lawn, where they can do like a 10 by 10 square or 10 foot by 10 foot, or make it larger or make it smaller, a 6 by 6 foot square of unmowed area in the center of their lawn. That's kind of isolated from all their tick habitats, where I tell people the ticks aren't attracted to the long grass. They're not attracted to the habitats. They just happen to end up there because they get dropped off by the host, or it's the host that move the ticks around. So if they happen to end up in long grass, they're much more likely to survive there and find their next host in long grass than they are shorter grass. But if you have a patch of unmowed area in the center of your yard where it's 10, 20 yards or 10, 20 feet away from the woods edge or other longer grass or other brush and leaf litter, it's, to me, is not the biggest risk, I would say. So it's nuanced, but if you're concerned, yes, mowing the lawn can help.
Any other questions?
Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, Patrick. And
Thank you.
just to say again, I will be sending out the link to the recording, and I'll also send any links that were included in the recording. So some of those things that Patrick posted, and also Leah posted a few things in the chat. So we'll try to get all that together and include it in an email. And finally, also the Zoom link for the October 9th presentation that Leah will give, that will be in the email as well, or in an email to come.
Great, thanks.
I guess that's it. Thank you very much, Patrick. Thanks everyone for coming, for joining.